You didn't enter life the way you think you did. Picture the first breath, not as a miracle, not as relief, but as a system handshake. A fragile body opening, lungs expanding, nerves firing, and something else locking in place at the same time. No sound, no signal, just a silent override. That moment is praised as freedom. It isn't. It's the beginning of a foreclosure. The idea that birth equals liberation is the first layer of conditioning. A narrative repeated so consistently that no one pauses to inspect it. But when you strip away the emotion and look at it with mechanical clarity, the structure reveals something colder. You were not introduced into the world. You were processed into it. The instant your nervous system connected to the environment, constraints were not learned. They were installed. Not through violence, but through interface. The system doesn't need to fight you. It integrates you. And what gets restricted first is not your actions. It's your range. In physics, a system's behavior is defined by its accessible states. Limit the range and you don't need to control the outcome. It becomes predictable on its own. That's what happened. Your original bandwidth, your capacity to perceive, decide, and act beyond friction was compressed, not removed. Compressed, like a high-voltage circuit rerouted through a narrow wire. The energy is still there, but now it heats the system instead of powering it. You feel that heat as effort, as fatigue, as the constant pressure to become something. And over time, you're taught to interpret that pressure as normal, necessary, even meaningful. The language evolves to protect the structure: growth, responsibility, reality. Terms that sound neutral but function as stabilizers, because once a constraint is accepted as truth, it no longer needs enforcement. Look at any ordinary day. You exchange time for income, manage uncertainty, anticipate risk. None of it feels imposed. It feels like life. But from a systems perspective, it's a feedback loop. Input, output, depletion, repeat. You are not just participating in the loop, you are sustaining it. Every unit of attention, every emotional spike, every cycle of anticipation feeds back into the same structure that limits your range. Not intentionally, mechanically. Like a machine that runs on its own heat. And here is where the distortion deepens. You begin to identify with the output instead of the source. You measure yourself by results, by position, by response from the environment. But those are downstream effects. They say nothing about the original architecture that produces them. It's like judging a signal without ever checking the frequency it's transmitted on. So the system doesn't need to hide anything. It just keeps you focused on the wrong layer. And once your attention stays there long enough, something subtle happens. You stop questioning the frame itself. You optimize within it. Improve your efficiency. Adjust your behavior. But you never step outside it. That's the foreclosure. Not a loss of ability, but a restriction of reference. You can still act, still decide, still create, but only within a predefined bandwidth. Like a player inside a game who forgets there's a console outside the screen. And the deeper implication isn't emotional, it's structural. If your operating range is constrained at the root, then every struggle you experience later isn't random. It's the natural outcome of a system running under limitation. The friction you feel is not resistance from the world. It's resistance from the configuration. Which means the question isn't how to perform better inside the structure. It's whether you've ever examined the structure itself. Because the moment you do, even briefly, the narrative begins to lose coherence. What once felt like fixed reality starts to look like a set of conditions. Adjustable, questionable, not absolute. And that shift is small, almost unnoticeable, but it's the first point where the system no longer runs uninterrupted. Not because you escaped it, but because you finally saw it. Chapter 1. The Holographic Birth Certificate. The Identity Fraud. The Three-Dimensional Baptism. If I remove your name from you for just 1 minute, what exactly remains that you still recognize as yourself? Picture a crowded room where someone suddenly calls your name, and without thinking, your entire body turns, your attention locks, your nervous system lines as if pulled by an invisible thread. That reflex feels intimate, almost sacred, yet the strange part is that it was never chosen. It was installed long before you developed the capacity to question it. And that is where the original crime scene hides. The foreclosure you felt in the introduction did not begin when life became difficult, nor when you signed your first contract or failed your first attempt. It began much earlier, in a place that looks harmless, sterile, even sacred, the biological operating room where identity itself was assigned. What you call yourself was not discovered, it was issued. Consider the act of naming something so normalized that it escapes scrutiny. Parents choose a sound, society records it, and from that moment forward, an entire system gains the ability to reference you, track you, and interact with you with precision, not unlike how a database assigns a unique key to every entry so it can be located, updated, and taxed. This is not philosophy. It is structure. Your name functions less like an essence and more like an access point. In neuroscience, identity is not a fixed object, but a pattern of repeated signals that the brain learns to associate with continuity. When that signal, your name, is triggered, your brain activates the same network over and over, reinforcing the illusion that the label and the being are the same thing, even though one is external code and the other is internal process. That confusion is the first reduction. From an open system capable of undefined states, you become a defined node, a unit inside a grid, something that can now be measured, categorized, and predicted, like placing a wild river into pipes. The water is still there, but its movement is no longer free. And the system does not stop at naming. It layers coordinates on top of it. Nationality appears next, presented as a neutral fact, yet functioning as a boundary condition. You are told where you belong, what economy you are part of, what opportunities statistically align with people from your region. And gradually, what began as geography becomes limitation. Sociologists have documented this under what is called social conditioning through expectation, where individuals unconsciously align their behavior with the perceived ceiling of their environment, not because they are forced to, but because they internalize the frame as reality. Then comes class, family history, financial background, each one tightening the parameters, like adjusting the settings of a machine so its output becomes more predictable, less volatile, easier to manage. The system does not need to stop you from exceeding those limits. It only needs you to believe they exist. And once belief is installed, enforcement becomes unnecessary. But the deepest layer is not the name or the coordinates. It is memory. Your biography feels like truth because it is filled with events you can recall, failures, rejections, moments that shaped your reactions. But from a systems perspective, it operates as a friction record, a log of constraints that your mind uses to forecast future behavior. In cognitive psychology, this aligns with what is known as predictive processing, where the brain continuously uses past data to predict, and limit future possibilities, reducing uncertainty, but also narrowing potential. So when you say, "I cannot do this because of what happened before," you are not describing reality. You are running a model built from incomplete data, and each time you run it, you reinforce it, like reopening an old file that drains resources simply by staying active. That is why the system does not erase your past. It encourages you to identify with it, because a person who defines themselves by their history becomes stable, predictable, and easy to process. A closed loop. The foreclosure is not a locked door. It is a loop you keep feeding. And here, the distortion reaches its peak. You begin to defend the very structures that limit you. You protect your identity, justify your background, explain your limitations as if they were personal truths rather than inherited parameters, much like someone defending the walls of a house without realizing those walls were built to contain them. But something shifts the moment you look at it, without attachment. Not rejecting your name, not denying your history, but seeing them for what they are, tools, not definitions. Because the system relies on identification, not on the label itself. Remove the identification and the label loses function. It still exists, but it no longer binds. Like a uniform hanging on a chair. Recognizable, but empty. And that is where the fracture begins. Not by destroying the system, but by stepping out of the automatic agreement that sustains it. Because once you are no longer fully defined by the name, the coordinates, and the memory, the system cannot interact with you in the same way. It can still attempt to, but it no longer finds the same fixed structure to attach to, which means what you called identity was never your foundation, it was your interface. And once that becomes clear, even briefly, the foreclosure that seemed absolute starts to look conditioned. Not broken yet, but no longer unquestioned. Chapter 2. The Creditors of Karma Annulling the Spiritual Debt. the tax fraud of the cosmos. The more you believe you deserve what happens to you, the easier it becomes to control you. Watch the mechanism carefully. Something collapses in your life, and before you even examine the facts, your mind moves to interpretation, quietly labeling the event as fair, necessary, even deserved, as if an invisible accountant had balanced a hidden ledger. That reflex feels intelligent, even spiritual, yet it closes the investigation before it begins. For a long time, older systems used a simpler version of this control, built on the idea that you entered existence already flawed and indebted, required to suffer, obey, and compensate for a condition you never verified. That model held power because it gave suffering a reason, and reason makes pain tolerable. But when that structure began to crack under intellectual pressure, it was not dismantled, it was redesigned. The language softened, the symbols changed, the authority became less visible, yet the core instruction remained intact. You owe something, and your life is the repayment. Karma replaced sin. Spiritual growth replaced obedience. And instead of priests, the message now arrives through modern voices that sound liberating while carrying the same architecture beneath them. You are told that every difficulty is a payment, every failure a correction, every loss a necessary adjustment for actions you supposedly took beyond your current memory or outside your present awareness. The explanation is intentionally untraceable, which makes it impossible to challenge. And because it feels cosmic, people accept it without audit. They begin to narrate their own suffering as justice. A business collapses, and it becomes a lesson. A betrayal occurs, and it becomes cleansing. A repeated struggle appears, and it becomes alignment. Not because those interpretations are proven, but because they prevent a more dangerous question from emerging. What if none of it is required? From a systems perspective, this belief functions as a perfect feedback loop. If you assume debt, you will allocate energy toward repayment. That energy does not disappear. It feeds the same structure that maintains the belief. The loop sustains itself, not through enforcement, through participation. This is not philosophy. It mirrors how any self-reinforcing system operates, where input justifies output and output reinforces input until the cycle becomes stable enough to feel like reality. And stability, in this case, does not mean truth. It means continuity. Now observe the second layer that strengthens this loop. The idea that suffering is necessary for growth. It appears logical on the surface because challenge can produce adaptation, but the system extends that idea beyond its functional limit and turns it into doctrine, suggesting that pain itself is a prerequisite for worth, that struggle is not just a condition but a requirement. Yet in any efficient system, learning reduces friction over time. It simplifies pathways. It eliminates unnecessary resistance. Persistent suffering that repeats without resolution is not optimized learning. It is inefficient processing, like a machine running the same cycle without updating its parameters. The metaphor of life as a school begins to fracture under this lens. A system designed for learning produces progression. A system designed for retention produces repetition. And repetition without exit is not education. It is containment. From there, the structure deepens further. Ancestral debt. You are told that your limitations originate not only from your own actions, but from the unresolved patterns of those who came before you, that your financial ceiling, your relational patterns, even your internal fears are echoes of a lineage you are now responsible to repair. There is partial truth in the transmission of behavior across generations. Psychology has long observed how patterns are learned and repeated, but observation is not obligation. The system reframes influence as debt. And once again, if you accept the debt, you will spend energy attempting to resolve it. The analogy is straightforward. Imagine renting a vehicle and being asked to pay for every violation committed by previous drivers. The request is unreasonable, yet if you emotionally accept it, you begin to act as if it were valid. The structure does not need to enforce compliance. It only needs your agreement. At this point, the mechanism reveals its anchor: guilt. Guilt is not merely an emotion. It is a persistent signal that something remains unpaid, unresolved, incomplete, and as long as that signal remains active, it consumes cognitive and emotional resources, maintaining the loop that feeds the system. Neuroscience describes how unresolved emotional states continue to occupy processing bandwidth, limiting flexibility and reinforcing existing patterns. Guilt, in that sense, is not moral depth. It is sustained load, and a system under constant load cannot expand its operational range. So the question shifts, not whether you're good or bad, but whether the loop is necessary at all. Because if the debt cannot be measured, cannot be verified, and continuously regenerates through belief, then structurally it behaves less like a law and more like a contract. And contracts require consent. Withdraw consent, and enforcement weakens. Not immediately in appearance, but immediately in principle. This is where the system responds, not symbolically, but through pressure. Events that appear to confirm the belief. Situations that trigger the old interpretation. Moments where it feels safer to return to the idea of karma than to remain in uncertainty. Because the belief, even if limiting, provides structure. And structure feels like control. But examine the pivot point. An event occurs. You choose not to classify it as punishment. You choose not to attach it to a narrative of repayment. You observe it as data, as movement, as adjustment within a system rather than judgment from an authority. That shift does not remove the event. It removes its leverage. Because without the narrative of debt, the event cannot anchor into identity. It passes through instead of embedding. And over time, repeated non-identification changes the system's behavior toward you. Not because the external world transforms instantly, but because the internal loop that sustained the interpretation has been interrupted, which means the structure that once felt inevitable begins to look conditional. Not dismantled yet, but no longer absolute. And once that certainty fractures, even slightly, the idea of spiritual debt loses its foundation. Not emotionally, structurally, and without a foundation, it cannot hold weight. Only belief. And belief, once examined, no longer carries the same authority. Chapter 3. Three-dimensional jurisdiction. The false laws of scarcity. The lower court. You never question the laws of your life because you were taught they were not negotiable. Look at the way you move through an ordinary day. You plan within limits, calculate within constraints, accept gravity, inflation, effort, and probability as if they were carved into the structure of reality itself, as if the universe had issued a fixed constitution and your only role was to comply. Yet that certainty, the quiet obedience to how things work, is precisely where the jurisdiction begins. The system does not need to control your actions if it controls what you believe cannot be changed. Classical physics, traditional economics, statistical medicine, these appear as objective descriptions of reality, but in practice, they function more like a legal framework, a lower court that governs the predictable behavior of systems operating under friction, under limitation, under unconscious repetition. Newton's laws describe how objects behave under force, but they do not prescribe what must be. Economic models describe patterns of exchange, but they do not define the totality of possibility. Statistics measure outcomes within a given set of conditions, but they do not dictate outcomes beyond those conditions. Yet the human system treats them as absolute, not as observations, as laws. And once a model is mistaken for a law, it becomes binding. That is the quiet shift from description to control, because a lower court only has authority over those who recognize its jurisdiction. If you accept that effort must equal reward, that scarcity is inherent, that probability governs your ceiling, then the system acquires the right to process you accordingly, to exchange your energy for limited return, to keep your output within predictable bounds, not through enforcement, through agreement. Take the so-called law of effort. From early education to corporate structure, it is repeated until it feels self-evident. More effort produces more results. Greater reward requires greater sacrifice. Nothing comes without cost. On the surface, this aligns with basic mechanics. Yet when applied universally, it becomes a constraint rather than a principle. In physical systems, excessive force often produces inefficiency, heat, friction, energy loss. While optimal systems operate through alignment, through minimal resistance, through intelligent distribution rather than brute application. The same pattern appears in biology. The human body does not grow through constant strain, but through cycles of stress and recovery, through efficiency, through conservation of energy. Yet in economic behavior, the narrative flips. You are encouraged to burn time, attention, and biological capacity in exchange for limited output, as if exhaustion were proof of value. It is not. It is evidence of inefficiency. If your capacity to accumulate resources is directly tied to the number of hours your body can sustain activity, then you are not operating in a scalable system. You are operating in a closed loop, a machine limited by its own hardware. And when a system is closed, growth becomes constrained by design. Now extend that structure to scarcity itself. You are told resources are limited, that markets are saturated, that opportunity is finite, and that competition is therefore necessary. This framework creates a zero-sum perception, where gain for one implies loss for another, reinforcing a constant state of tension and comparison. But examine the assumption. At a fundamental level, the universe does not operate on fixed supply in the way these models suggest. Even within human systems, new value is constantly generated through innovation, through reconfiguration, through the creation of entirely new categories that did not previously exist. Scarcity, then, is not an absolute condition. It is a contextual projection, a model applied to a specific layer of reality and then mistaken for the whole. Like looking at a single frame and assuming it defines the entire sequence. And once that projection is accepted, behavior aligns with it. You compete, you restrict, you calculate within limits that were never inherently fixed, which brings the mechanism into sharper focus. These laws function because they are internalized, not because they are enforced externally. The system presents a projection, economic forecasts, medical statistics, probability curves, and the moment you react to it emotionally, the moment fear or belief enters, the process completes. You have signed, not with ink, with attention. In behavioral science, expectation directly influences outcome through what is known as anticipatory conditioning. When you believe a certain result is likely, your decisions begin to align with that expectation, increasing the probability of that very result. The system does not need to guarantee failure. It only needs you to expect it. And expectation is enough. So the critical shift is not to deny information. It is to withdraw automatic agreement. An economic downturn is announced. Instead of internalizing it as a limit, you observe it as a variable. A statistic is presented. Instead of treating it as a prediction, you recognize it as a measurement of past conditions. The difference is subtle, but structurally decisive. Because without emotional confirmation, the data remains data. It does not convert into constraint. And without constraint, the lower court loses leverage. This does not remove the external system. It changes your interaction with it. You are no longer processed as a predictable unit within its parameters. You become an outlier, not through force, through non-alignment. In statistical models, outliers are not governed by the same averages because they operate outside the assumptions that define the dataset. They are not anomalies by accident, but by configuration, which means probability itself is conditional. It applies within a defined range. Outside that range, it loses relevance. And once that is understood, another shift becomes available. You stop negotiating with the system. You begin to define your position within it, not by rejecting reality, but by recognizing which layer of reality you are engaging with. Because if the laws you accepted are contextual rather than absolute, then your role is not to obey them blindly. It is to decide whether they apply. And that decision is not symbolic. It determines how the system processes you. At that point, the structure reorganizes, not externally first, internally. Your actions begin to reflect a different assumption. Your responses carry less friction. Your decisions are no longer anchored to inherited limits. And gradually, the interaction between you and the environment shifts. Not dramatically at once, but consistently. Because systems adapt to the inputs they receive. And when the input changes, the output cannot remain identical. Which means what you once called reality was not a fixed court issuing final sentences. It was a jurisdiction you kept recognizing. And once recognition becomes optional, authority becomes conditional. Not eliminated, but no longer absolute. And that is the point where the structure begins to loosen. Not because it disappeared, but because you stopped treating it as the highest court. Chapter 4. The Biological Auditor. The ego as the system's lawyer. The Trojan horse in your skull. Long before anyone tried to control your actions, something much more efficient was placed inside you. Something that does not need permission, does not require supervision, and does not leave, because it operates through your own thinking and speaks in your own voice. Notice how early it begins. Before the day even unfolds, before any external pressure appears, there is already a running commentary inside your head, interpreting, predicting, warning, adjusting. It feels inseparable from you, as if it were the core of your awareness. Yet, if you observe it carefully, you begin to see a strange pattern. It never creates anything new. It only reacts, compares, and limits. That distinction is not philosophical. It is mechanical. The system that could not rely on external force to maintain control embedded the control mechanism directly into your central nervous system, creating a feedback loop that feels like identity but functions like supervision. In neuroscience, this aligns with predictive processing, where the brain continuously models future outcomes based on past data to reduce uncertainty, a useful tool for survival, but a severe limitation when mistaken for authority. Because survival and expansion are not the same process, the ego, in its operational form, is optimized for one thing: keeping the organism within safe parameters, and it performs that task with remarkable efficiency by presenting itself as logic, as reason, as common sense. It does not command you directly. It persuades you. When you attempt to move beyond your current conditions, it immediately constructs a case using evidence that appears undeniable. Your past failures, your current resources, external statistics, all arranged in a coherent argument that sounds responsible rather than restrictive. And because the argument is structured, you trust it. But examine the source of that structure. Every piece of evidence it presents is drawn from what has already happened, from a limited dataset generated under constrained conditions, which means the conclusions it reaches are inherently conservative, designed to preserve the current state rather than transform it. In computational terms, it is a processor with limited memory attempting to simulate a system with variables it cannot access, and when pushed beyond its capacity, it does what any overloaded system does: it generates noise. That noise is experienced as anxiety, not as a mystical signal, as thermal overload. The more you demand that this limited processor calculate outcomes beyond its available data, the more friction it produces, until the system begins to stall, loop, or shut down, which is why intense ambition often correlates with heightened stress when filtered through the ego's framework. The failure is not in the ambition, it is in the processor being used to manage it. And this is where the mechanism becomes self-reinforcing. The discomfort created by overload is interpreted as a warning, and that warning is then used as justification to retreat, reinforcing the belief that limitation is wisdom and expansion is risk. Over time, this loop becomes indistinguishable from intuition, yet the two operate on entirely different principles. The ego's signal is always tied to preservation, to minimizing exposure, to maintaining equilibrium, while genuine intuition, when observed without interpretation, does not negotiate. It directs, often without providing reasons, often without reducing discomfort, sometimes even increasing it. One contracts, the other moves. But because both can appear subtle, they are easily confused, and the system exploits that confusion to maintain control even when the more obvious forms of fear are no longer effective. At this stage, most attempts to break free fail not because the mechanism is too strong, but because the response is misguided. People try to argue with the ego, to override it with positive statements, or to suppress it through force. Yet every form of engagement reinforces the loop, because attention functions as energy within the system. The more you engage, the more the pathway strengthens. The more the pathway strengthens, the more dominant the signal becomes. So the solution is not confrontation. It is withdrawal of authority. Imagine the ego not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a background process that has been mistakenly given administrative control. You do not need to eliminate the process, you simply revoke its privileges, allowing it to continue running without influencing core operations. In practical terms, this means observing the voice without responding to it, allowing it to present its arguments without accepting them as directives, creating a separation between the signal and the decision. That separation changes the entire system. Because once the ego is no longer treated as the decision maker, its role collapses back to its original function, basic survival management, while higher order processes operate without interference. And when that interference drops, something unexpected emerges. Silence. Not the absence of thought, but the absence of compulsory narration. the constant need to explain, justify, and predict begins to fade, and in that space, action becomes more direct, less negotiated, less constrained by past data. This is not impulsivity, it is reduced friction. Decisions are made without prolonged internal debate because the system is no longer routing every possibility through a processor designed to avoid uncertainty. At the same time, biological reactions continue to occur. Heart rate increases, adrenaline rises. But these signals are no longer interpreted as commands. They are treated as mechanical responses, similar to how a vehicle engine may increase output under load without altering the direction chosen by the driver. This distinction prevents the body from dictating the mind, and as this state stabilizes, the structure of identity itself begins to shift. Without continuous narration, the sense of self as a fixed story weakens, replaced by a more fluid awareness that is not anchored to past outcomes or projected fears, which in turn removes the primary reference point the system uses to apply control, because control requires a target, and a target requires definition. When definition dissolves, even partially, the system's ability to predict and constrain behavior decreases, not because the external environment changes, but because the internal compliance that sustained it has been withdrawn. At that point, the internal auditor remains present but isolated, functioning within a limited scope without access to core decisions, like a dismissed advisor still speaking but no longer influencing policy. And with that shift, the most critical layer of the foreclosure begins to break. Not through force, not through resistance, but through a simple structural correction. The recognition that the voice you have trusted as yourself was never designed to lead you beyond the boundaries it was built to protect. Chapter 5. The Writ of Amparo. The Sovereignty of Absolute Zero. The Slave's Casino. Every time you try to fix your life using the same rules that created the problem, you are feeding the system that is draining you. Watch what happens in a real crisis, not in theory, but in the raw behavior of people under pressure. A business begins to collapse, debt increases, opportunities shrink, and the immediate instinct is always the same: to act faster, negotiate harder, work longer, push more energy into the system that is already extracting from them, as if intensity alone could reverse a structure designed to absorb it. This reaction feels intelligent because it is active, but structurally, it is submission. Trying to solve a system-generated problem from within that same system is equivalent to playing a rigged game more aggressively, believing that effort can overcome design. Casinos do not lose because players lack discipline. They win because the rules guarantee that participation itself is the loss mechanism. The system does not require you to fail. It only requires you to engage. Every negotiation, every extra hour, every emotional reaction becomes input, and that input is converted into energy that sustains the structure you are trying to escape. You are not being punished for inefficiency. You are being processed for participation. That is why effort alone never breaks the loop. It reinforces it. Because effort, when applied within a closed system, increases throughput without altering structure. Which means the only effective move is not better action. It is withdrawal from the rule set. This is where the writ of Amparo emerges, not as a metaphor, but as a functional shift in how you interact with pressure. In legal systems, a writ of Amparo is issued to halt the actions of an authority that exceeds its jurisdiction, creating an immediate suspension that protects the individual from further enforcement. Translated into behavior, it is the refusal to recognize the legitimacy of the demand being placed on you. When a crisis appears, financial pressure, external threat, urgency demanding response, the instinct is to react, to calculate, to engage. The Amparo interrupts that reflex by removing the assumption that the crisis has authority over your actions. Not denying the event, denying its jurisdiction. This changes the entire dynamic, because the system relies on reaction to evolve. Every problem introduced into your environment requires time, attention, and emotional input to grow, to escalate, to generate consequences. Without those inputs, its capacity to expand becomes limited. In physics, unstable systems require continuous interaction to evolve. Without energy input, they tend towards stabilization or decay. The same principle applies here. When you remove reaction, you remove fuel. This is not passivity. It is containment. Instead of feeding the system with urgency, you hold position. reducing output to near zero. Not because nothing is happening, but because you are no longer contributing to the escalation. And this produces an effect that feels counterintuitive at first. The situation does not immediately disappear, but it stops accelerating. Like a fire deprived of oxygen, it may still burn briefly, but it cannot expand. Over time, without new input, it begins to weaken. This is where most people fail. Not because the method is ineffective, but because the discomfort of non-action triggers the very response that feeds the system again. They interpret stillness as risk, they re-engage, and the loop resumes. But if the withdrawal is sustained, something else becomes visible. The crisis was never a fixed entity. It was a process, and processes require participation. Remove participation, and the process cannot complete in the same way, which leads to a second layer of pressure. Provocation. When direct extraction fails, the system shifts tactics. It introduces social pressure, external opinions, subtle accusations, signals designed to trigger response, to pull you back into engagement through identity rather than circumstance. You are called passive, irresponsible, unrealistic, and the instinct to defend emerges. To explain, justify, prove, but defense is engagement. The moment you argue, you acknowledge the premise, you validate the framework, and the system regains access. This is why silence becomes strategic. Not silence as avoidance, but silence as refusal to enter the frame. If a claim has no recognized authority, it does not require rebuttal. It dissipates on its own, like sound waves hitting a surface that does not reflect them. And in that absence of reflection, the energy behind the attack collapses because it has nothing to attach to, which produces a shift not only in the situation, but in your position within it. You are no longer a participant reacting to conditions. You become the point around which conditions reorganize, not through force, through non-compliance with the expected pattern. This state resembles what in systems theory would be described as a stable node, an element that does not oscillate with external fluctuations, allowing the surrounding system to adjust relative to it, rather than the other way around. In practical terms, this means chaos may continue around you, but it does not propagate through you. And without propagation, its influence remains localized. Which is why, over time, the environment begins to present different outcomes. Not because the external world is fundamentally changed, but because the interaction has. Without continuous input, the system must resolve itself differently, sometimes through decay, sometimes through redirection, sometimes through disappearance. And this produces a state that feels unusual, not control in the conventional sense, but insulation. You move through the same environment exposed to the same variables, yet less affected by them, because the primary mechanism of influence, your reaction, has been removed. This is what sovereignty looks like in functional terms, not dominance over the system, independence from its automatic processes. And once that independence stabilizes, the role itself changes. You are no longer trying to make better moves within the game. You are no longer optimizing decisions under imposed constraints. You are operating from a position where those constraints are no longer automatically applied, which means the system must adjust to you, not the other way around. And that adjustment is not immediate, but it is inevitable, because systems respond to the patterns they receive. And when the pattern changes at its source, the output cannot remain the same indefinitely. This is the threshold, not the destruction of the system, but the loss of its automatic authority. And once that authority is no longer assumed, even internally, the structure that once dictated your responses begins to loosen. Not visibly at first, but fundamentally. And that is where the foreclosure begins to fail. Not because it was removed, but because it is no longer being enforced through your own participation. Chapter 6. Expropriation of others' energy, evicting the toxic ecosystem. The fastest way to lose everything you are building is not through failure, but through the people you keep close. Not because they intend harm in the way you imagine, but because systems do not always operate through direct attack. When pressure cannot enter through the front door, it moves through the channels you already trust, through conversations, habits, and relationships that feel normal enough to escape inspection, yet quietly shape your internal state. Look carefully at your environment, not sentimentally, but structurally. Every interaction you repeat becomes part of your operating system. The friend who constantly speaks about scarcity, the relative who rehearses financial struggle, the partner who frames ambition as risk. None of these exchanges remain neutral. They introduce patterns, expectations, and emotional tones that your nervous system begins to mirror. This is not metaphor. It aligns with what psychology describes as emotional contagion, where repeated exposure to another person's state alters your own baseline without conscious awareness. And once that baseline shifts, your decisions follow. Because you do not act from intention alone, you act from state, which means your ecosystem is not just social. It is energetic in the most practical sense. It determines how much clarity, stability, and focus you can sustain over time. And if that ecosystem is filled with friction, your output will reflect it. Not because you lack discipline, because the input is compromised. This is where the common misunderstanding appears. People believe maintaining relationships is inherently positive, that loyalty requires tolerance, that empathy requires immersion. They are taught from early childhood to share emotional weight, to carry each other's burdens, to equate closeness with involvement. But involvement has a cost. If you continuously absorb unstable patterns, you begin to replicate them, not intentionally, mechanically, like a system synchronizing with the strongest signal it receives. So what is called empathy often becomes duplication, not support, replication of limitation. And over time that replication accumulates. Your attention fragments, your focus weakens. Your internal environment becomes crowded with signals that do not originate from your own direction. Which means the system does not need to drain you directly. It distributes the drain across your network. The effect is the same: reduced capacity. From a systems perspective, this is inefficient allocation. Energy that could be directed toward construction is continuously redirected toward maintenance of unstable inputs. And maintenance never produces expansion. It sustains equilibrium at best, which is why separation becomes necessary, not as rejection, not as emotional reaction, but as structural correction. If a connection consistently reduces clarity, it is not neutral. It is a leak. And leaks in any system must be sealed, not negotiated, not explained, because explanation creates friction, and friction reactivates the loop. The correction is simpler. You reduce exposure, you limit interaction. You withdraw attention, not dramatically, not theatrically, but decisively, like shutting off a valve. At first the system reacts, because every established pattern resists interruption. Messages increase, pressure appears, emotional signals intensify. Not as coincidence, but as an attempt to restore the previous flow. And this is where most people reverse the decision. They respond, they explain, they re-engage, and the loop stabilizes again. But if the withdrawal holds, something else happens. The connection weakens, not because the other person changes, because the pathway is no longer active. And without activation, the system cannot sustain the same level of influence. This applies not only to people, but to information. What you consume repeatedly shapes your perception of reality. News cycles, social feeds, conversations filled with noise. Each one introducing patterns that your mind processes, whether you intend it or not. In cognitive science, this is described as attentional shaping, where repeated inputs determine what the brain prioritizes, filters, and reacts to. Which means uncontrolled input produces uncontrolled output. If your mental environment is saturated with low-value signals, your processing capacity is occupied before you even begin to act. So filtration becomes essential, not as preference, as function. You do not eliminate information because it is unpleasant. You eliminate it because it does not contribute to stability or expansion. And once that filtration is applied consistently, a different state begins to emerge. Silence. Not isolation in the emotional sense, but reduction of interference. At first, it feels unfamiliar, because most people rarely experience a system without constant input. But within that silence, something becomes clear. Your own signal, not louder, more distinct. And as that signal stabilizes, your capacity increases, not gradually, noticeably, because energy that was previously distributed across multiple channels returns to a single point. Focus sharpens, decisions simplify, execution accelerates, not because you are trying harder, because you are no longer divided. This is what happens when leaks are sealed. The system becomes coherent, and coherence produces efficiency, which produces results. From there, the effect compounds. The more stable your internal environment, the less external noise can influence it. The less influence, the more consistent your output. The more consistent the output, the more predictable the results, not in a restrictive sense, but in a controlled one. And this control is not imposed, it is generated, because the system now operates from a unified state, instead of reacting to multiple conflicting inputs, which leads to a final shift. You are no longer maintaining your environment. You are defining it, not through force, through selection. What enters, what remains, what is removed. And once that selection becomes precise, the ecosystem reorganizes around it. Not because others change, because your interaction with them has. Which means what once felt like a network of influence becomes a controlled field. And within that field, your capacity is no longer distributed. It is concentrated. And concentration in any system produces power. Not symbolic power, operational power. The kind that does not need to announce itself, because it is visible in the outcome. And that outcome is not created by adding more. It is created by removing what was never aligned to begin with. Chapter 7. The 0-point trial where the magistrate is you. The defendant syndrome, begging to the void. There is a moment, almost invisible, when desire turns into begging, and that is the exact moment you lose authority over reality. Look at it without emotion. Whenever a human being wants something large, real power, real capital, real expansion, they do not issue a command, they build a case. They gather reasons, polish their intentions, and then project those reasons upward for an imagined authority, whether they call it God, the market, the universe, or the quantum field. The structure is always the same. They stand like defendants in a courtroom, waiting to be evaluated. And listen carefully to the language, because the entire system is encoded there. I've worked hard. I've been fair. I didn't hurt anyone. I come from nothing. These are not statements of power. They are mitigating arguments. They are attempts to prove worthiness before a judge that was never actually there. That posture is not humility. It is thermodynamic submission. Because the moment you argue your innocence, you have already accepted that something above you has the right to decide your outcome. And once that hierarchy is accepted, the gavel is no longer in your hand. This is the final bureaucratic illusion in the architecture of control, the defendant syndrome. You continue to treat conscious matter as if it were an external tribunal, impartial, majestic, seated somewhere beyond reach, evaluating your moral performance and deciding whether you deserve access to wealth, success, or expansion. As long as that image remains intact, the system retains control because you have voluntarily handed over jurisdiction. So the first act in this chapter is not motivational, it is surgical. You must kill the concept of merit, not soften it, not reinterpret it, erase it. Because the universe, at the level this text is operating from, does not function as a moral evaluator. It does not reward the exhausted because they worked harder. It does not compensate the kind because they meant well. It does not punish the ruthless because they violated some ethical code. The field does not carry sentiment, it carries response. Physics gives a clearer model than morality here. A field responds to density, to charge, to configuration. It reflects what is present, not what is deserved. When you beg for something because you believe you earned it, the field does not process your story. It processes the state behind it. And the state behind begging is always lack. So the reflection returns lack. Not as punishment, as correspondence. This is why the operator rejects merit completely. To deserve implies there is a superior authority evaluating you. To wait for evaluation is to accept delay. To accept delay is to remain in the dock. The monarch does not deserve the kingdom. He occupies it by weight. Once that becomes clear, not conceptually but structurally, the entire courtroom shifts. The external tribunal collapses, not because it was destroyed, but because it was never populated the way you believed. The bench is empty, and that emptiness is the opening. Imagine the courtroom in full darkness, the same one where you have spent years waiting, sweating under invisible judgment, watching markets rise and fall, watching decisions made outside of you determine your trajectory. You have been seated below, waiting for permission disguised as opportunity. Now stand. Do not argue with the bailiffs. Do not justify the movement. Do not look back at the evidence. Walk forward. Slowly, deliberately, like something that no longer negotiates. Climb the steps. Sit in the chair. Take the rope. At that exact moment, jurisdiction inverts. The 0 point is not external. It is not suspended in some abstract quantum sky. It is located precisely where you have never been taught to look, at the center of your own system. The authority you projected outward collapses inward. The court does not disappear. It relocates. Now everything else is in the dock. The market, the banks, your competitors, your past conditions. They are the ones waiting. And this is where the real weight of the chapter appears, because once you sit on that bench, blame ends completely. There is no longer an external system to accuse, no injustice to complain about, no delay to negotiate. There is only one authority left in the room: you. And that responsibility is heavier than victimhood, because victimhood allows appeal. Authority eliminates it. From that position, language must change. The judge does not hope, does not try, does not negotiate, and does not decorate commands with emotion. The judge issues rulings. The old language of the slave: I hope this works, I want this contract, I am attracting wealth. All of it leaks time, effort, and uncertainty. It assumes process where there should be finality. The syntax of sovereignty is colder. It sounds like a decision that has already occurred. The objective is annexed. The capital is transferred. The result is established. No emphasis, no excitement, no delay, just execution. And the moment that ruling is issued, the system behaves exactly like a losing party in a real court. It appeals. It rushes forward with evidence. Your current bank balance, rejection emails, economic downturns, statistics, all presented with urgency, all attempting to reopen the case. The argument is always the same. This ruling violates reality. If you look at that evidence in fear, you have accepted the appeal. If you debate it internally, you have stepped down from the bench. If you allow logic to cross-examine your own decision, the ruling dissolves under friction. So the operator does something that feels almost unnatural at first. He rejects the appeal without reading it. This is not denial of data. It is denial of authority. The evidence is declared irrelevant. The resistance of matter is classified as non-binding. The ruling stands. The case is closed. No further discussion. This is the jurisprudence of the singularity. And here is where the chapter escalates beyond individual outcomes. You are no longer deciding isolated cases. You are writing precedent. In law, precedent defines how future cases are handled. In the same way, every time you maintain a ruling without collapsing into doubt, you establish a new internal law. The old law said life requires struggle, capital requires effort, and opportunity requires permission. Now the law changes. Assets move without begging. Capital responds without moral evaluation. Matter organizes without negotiation. And once that precedent stabilizes, the environment adapts. Not because it's been convinced, but because it has been instructed. Contracts begin to appear without the old rituals of effort. Opportunities align without the previous resistance. The field adjusts to the jurisdiction you have established. You have stopped begging. You have removed the defendant posture. You have taken the bench. And the most important shift has already occurred. Conscious matter is no longer treated as a judge. It is recognized as a medium, dense, neutral, responsive, waiting for structure, not for argument. You issue the structure. It takes form. At this point, the trial is over. There are no pending cases, no unresolved verdicts, no authority left to consult. The system has been audited, the illusion of judgment dismantled, and the jurisdiction reclaimed. But the chapter closes with something critical that cannot be softened. A ruling that is never executed is still fiction. If you remain passive in the physical layer, if you continue to tolerate limitation, delay, or mediocrity for the sake of comfort, then the bench has been occupied only in language, not in function. The foreclosure has been legally broken. Now the vault must be entered, and the gold must be taken. Chapter 8. Asset Restitution. Collecting the withheld capital. The trap of peace of mind. The moment you finally feel at peace is the exact moment the system expects you to stop. Not when you are struggling, not when you are drowning in pressure, but precisely when the internal noise fades and a sense of lightness appears in your chest. When the tension that once dictated your every move dissolves and you begin to believe that you have arrived somewhere meaningful. This is where the most refined trap closes, because what you are experiencing is not completion. It is relief. And relief is dangerously easy to mistake for victory. You have already dismantled what kept you contained. You stripped away the identity that was assigned to you. You declared bankruptcy on inherited debt. You withdrew your consent from the laws that governed your behavior, and you took back the position of authority that you had projected outward for years. So the foreclosure has been lifted, the internal war has ended, and yet this is exactly where most people collapse into the most silent form of surrender. They stop moving. Observe the behavior that follows this state. The individual who was once overwhelmed now becomes calm. The one who was anxious now becomes still, and instead of converting that regained capacity into expansion, they begin to orbit around that calmness as if it were the objective itself. They retreat into controlled environments. They cultivate inner balance. They learn to smile at adversity, and they declare themselves abundant within, while their external reality remains structurally identical to what it was before. Nothing has changed except how they feel about it. And that is why the system allows it. Because a calm individual who still operates within the same constraints does not disrupt anything. The system does not resist your peace as long as that peace does not translate into extraction of real value, into movement of real capital, into acquisition of real territory. Because internal comfort without external expansion is not a threat. It is containment disguised as awakening. This is the victory of the castrated. Not destroyed, not broken, but neutralized at the exact point where power should have been exercised. Because stopping at peace while tolerating limitation is structurally equivalent to winning a legal case and refusing to collect the compensation. The ruling exists, the entitlement is real, but the assets remain untouched, locked behind a door that no one forces you to open. So the correction here cannot be soft. You did not dismantle the system to feel better. You dismantled it to collect. And to collect, you must first face something the system never wants you to calculate: the magnitude of what has been taken from you. Not in abstract terms, not in emotional language, but in accumulated loss. Every cycle of fear that kept you awake at night, every moment of anxiety about survival, every hour spent operating under pressure without authority, every decision made from limitation rather than clarity. These are not intangible experiences. They are measurable expenditures of energy, attention, and cognitive capacity, continuously redirected into a structure that returned only a fraction of what it extracted. In behavioral and neurological terms, prolonged exposure to stress reduces executive function, compresses decision-making ability, and limits long-term output. Translated into plain reality, you are operating below your potential while continuously giving more than you were receiving. That difference does not disappear. It accumulates. And because energy is never destroyed but only redistributed, what was taken from you still exists within the system that absorbed it. This is why restitution is not a desire. It is a correction. You are not asking for more than your share. You are reclaiming what was withheld. And the posture required for that is fundamentally different from anything conditioned behavior has practiced. Because the conditioned mind still negotiates, still requests, still frames outcomes as possibilities rather than directives, while restitution operates from finality. You do not ask, you execute. Not through force, not through effort, but through a level of internal certainty that removes hesitation entirely. The outcome is no longer something to be pursued. It is something to be processed, and once processed, it begins to appear through the most efficient channels available to it. And when it begins, when capital moves faster than before, when opportunities align without the old resistance, when results exceed the patterns you were used to, the next barrier emerges immediately. And it does not come from outside, it comes from your own system. Because the organism that lived under limitation is not calibrated for sudden expansion, it has been conditioned to associate large increases with instability. And so when the flow intensifies, the body reacts, the pulse accelerates, attention sharpens, and a subtle impulse appears to slow everything down to something more familiar. That impulse is not intelligence. It is fear of scale. You do not dramatize. You do not amplify the experience. You normalize it. You look at the increase in capacity with the same neutrality you would apply to any other data point, allowing it to integrate rate without resistance, because what is accepted without reaction stabilizes, while what is overemphasized becomes unstable. Neutrality allows continuation. From there, the process moves into its physical phase, because capital that remains abstract, ideas, possibilities, fluid movement, remains unstable, while capital that is converted into structure, contracts, ownership, systems, assets, gains weight and resists fluctuation. This is not about effort, it is about conversion. You take what is fluid and you make it solid. Each conversion increases stability, each structure increases control, and as that structure expands, your position becomes denser, more stable, more capable of holding and directing flow. And in any dynamic system, density attracts movement, not through force, but through inevitability. This is where competition begins to dissolve. Not because it is destroyed directly, but because unstable systems under pressure begin to collapse on their own, making reactive decisions, exhausting resources and fragmenting their focus, while a stable system absorbs what becomes available without needing to chase it. Expansion occurs through coherence, not conflict. And over time, what looked like competition becomes consolidation, what looked like effort becomes alignment, and what looked like struggle becomes unnecessary. But the chapter does not end in expansion alone, because the system does not disappear. It adapts. When direct control is no longer possible, it shifts to indirect influence, distraction, validation loops, noise, complexity designed to reintroduce friction into a system that had finally become stable. If you re-engage with that noise, even partially, the process reverses. So the final movement is reduction. You remove what does not contribute, you ignore what does not align, you operate with precision instead of exposure. Because coherence must be protected. At this point, restitution is no longer conceptual. It is already in motion. You have stopped settling for internal comfort in the middle of external limitation. You have stopped negotiating for fragments, and you have begun the collection of what was always yours. The assets are no longer withheld. They are moving. And the system, having lost its claim over you, is forced into the only position it has left. It must respond, but it will not respond quietly. It will regroup. It will attempt new forms of interference, broader, less visible, more diffuse, and that is why the final instruction is not expansion. It is concealment. You reduce your surface, you increase your density, you become difficult to influence, difficult to disturb. You become osmium, and you remain cold. Chapter 9. Lead Shielding, Evading New Foreclosures. The Egregor's Alarm. You thought taking the gold was the hard part. Keeping it without being seen is where most collapse. The moment an ordinary person begins behaving in a way the system cannot statistically predict, something subtle but precise begins to move against them. Not as punishment, but as correction. Any complex system, financial, biological, or digital, detects deviation first, then isolates it, then attempts to reintegrate it back into equilibrium. You are no longer behaving like the average pattern, therefore you are flagged, not by a person, by structure. Look at how markets react to anomalies. When a trader consistently outperforms randomness, algorithms begin to track behavior. When a company scales too fast, regulators appear. When an organism grows abnormally, the immune system intervenes. The same architecture governs your position now. The moment your internal state stabilized into something that no longer leaks fear or hesitation, your external results stopped following the expected curve. And the system noticed. Not with noise, but with precision. It does not rush toward you directly, because direct pressure already failed in the earlier thresholds where fear, identity, and debt were dismantled. Instead, it approaches through what remains unguarded, and what remains unguarded is not weakness, but subtle attachment. The first entry point is pride, not loud arrogance, but the quiet impulse to confirm that what you now hold is real. Watch closely how people behave after sudden success. The posture changes, speech expands, signals increase. They begin to narrate their rise, justify it, display it. In psychological terms, this is compensation, years of suppression released through visibility. But structurally, visibility is exposure, because any system that emits more signal becomes easier to map. In physics, the brighter the emission, the easier the detection. In digital systems, the more activity, the clearer the footprint. In human behavior, the more you broadcast, the more predictable you become. So, when you display, you locate yourself. And once located, you can be engaged. This is why the original structure does not attack power. It provokes its expression. It does not need to take your capital if it can make you announce it, because once you announce it, you enter a network of reactions: attention, expectation, rivalry, regulation. Each one introduces friction, not because they are malicious, but because they respond. And response is enough. So the adjustment is not suppression of success. It is the removal of the need to display it. You operate like systems that carry enormous capacity, but minimal noise. Infrastructure, deep capital, or large-scale algorithms that move billions quietly. Their strength is not visible in constant motion, but in controlled presence. From the outside, nothing appears excessive. From the inside, everything is precise. This is the density without signal. From here, the system escalates differently. If it cannot locate you through pride, it expands the environment itself, introducing broad-spectrum disturbance. Economic instability, social panic, global uncertainty, not to target you specifically, but to flood the field you exist in. This is not random. It is environmental pressure. When enough individuals respond to the same signal, fear of recession, fear of loss, fear of collapse, the collective behavior shifts, and that shift becomes reality. Economists describe this as reflexivity, where perception drives outcome. Psychologists frame it as collective conditioning. But for you, the question is simpler. Do you process the signal? If you do, you synchronize with the environment. If you do not, you remain independent of it. So the function here is not resistance. It is non-participation at the level of interpretation. You do not need to deny what is happening. You need to stop translating it into internal state. Just as a well-insulated system maintains its internal temperature regardless of external fluctuation, your internal calibration remains unchanged while the environment oscillates. This is not theory. It is observable. Some individuals collapse under identical conditions where others expand, not because the external event differs, but because internal processing does. The same recession destroys one business and multiplies another, not by chance, but by structure. So you become insulated, not emotionally detached, but structurally stable. And when stability holds, the system shifts again. It compresses time. Urgency appears. Deadlines tighten, opportunities accelerate, pressure mounts in the form of now or never. This is a known behavioral trigger. Under urgency, the brain reduces complexity, prioritizes speed over accuracy, and defaults to reactive patterns. So urgency is not opportunity. It is compression. And compression creates error. If you accept the imposed timeline, you accept the imposed structure. And once that happens, your decision-making re-enters the same loop that governed the earlier stages: effort, reaction, adjustment. So the correction is simple but difficult. You remove yourself from imposed urgency. You decide when to move. If something disappears because you did not react fast enough, it was dependent on speed, not alignment. Structures that require immediate reaction often rely on your lack of stability. So you slow down, not physically, internally. And when pride is absent, noise is filtered, and urgency is neutralized, something else becomes visible. Pressure has nowhere to attach. In wave mechanics, when energy meets a surface that does not absorb or distort it, the energy reflects. The same occurs here. Attempts to provoke reaction, whether through attention, fear, or time pressure, do not dissipate inside you. They redirect, not as revenge, as consequence. The environment begins to reorganize around your lack of response. Competitors destabilize under the same signals that no longer affect you. Systems that attempted to engage you redirect energy elsewhere. Structures that required your participation begin to weaken without it. You do not intervene. You remain. And remaining is enough, because systems built on reaction cannot sustain themselves without input. Over time, the system reduces effort toward you, not because you defeated it, because you are inefficient to engage. And this is where the chapter resolves into something quiet but irreversible. You are no longer part of the reactive field. You are not resisting it, not opposing it, not fighting it. You are simply not available to it. And when that happens, protection is no longer an action. It becomes a condition. Yet one final layer remains beneath this stability. Even now, there is still a subtle assumption that you and the system are separate, that you are maintaining distance from something external. As long as that assumption exists, the architecture is not fully dissolved, because separation itself is the last interface through which re-entry can occur. So remain still, remain cold, because the final threshold is not about shielding anymore. It is about removing the idea that there was ever anything outside you to shield against. Chapter 10. The Title Deed. The Owner of the Board. The egregor's last trap. The owner's paranoia. The last chain is not poverty, fear, karma, or effort. The last chain is ownership. That sounds absurd to the human mind because ownership is presented as the final reward, the proof that the battle was won, the legal seal that says the empire is now yours. Yet this is exactly where the final trap is hidden, because the instant your ego looks at the money, the company, the territory, the restored capital, and says with satisfaction, "This is mine," it has already recreated the distance through which loss becomes possible. Look at the mechanism with the same coldness that carried you through the previous thresholds. You've severed the false identity, bankrupted the spiritual debt, revoked the authority of linear law, silenced the internal auditor, reclaimed withheld capital, and wrapped the empire in lead shielding. You crossed the siege, you walked out with the gold. But if now, after all that, you still imagine yourself as an owner standing apart from what was collected, then the foreclosure has not been dissolved at its root. It has only changed costume. Because possession, in the common human sense, always contains separation. If I own something, then there is me here and the object there. There is a space between subject and asset, between the one who possesses and the thing possessed. And wherever that gap exists, time enters. Wherever time enters, anxiety follows close behind, because the mind immediately begins calculating decay, theft, erosion, competition, inflation, betrayal, accident, and death. The owner becomes a guard. The rich man becomes a watchman walking the perimeter of his own vault. The corporation becomes a fragile object requiring defense. The empire stops being weight and becomes a source of paranoia. That is the final absurdity. After everything, the slave still does not become free. He simply becomes a better-dressed prisoner. This is why the chapter turns against one of the deepest assumptions in religion, philosophy, and ordinary perception, the assumption of duality. You have been taught from childhood that there is a creator on one side and creation on the other, an observer here and the world over there, a self inside the skin and a market outside it. This fiction is so deeply installed that even when people accumulate wealth or influence, they still behave as separate beings managing external objects. They speak of my money, my company, my assets, never noticing that hidden inside the phrase is the confession of distance. And distance is friction. At the level of matter, that fiction becomes harder and harder to defend. The body that says I am here is made of the same field that constitutes the gold, the buildings, the screens, the contracts, the machines, and the people it believes it confronts. Physics does not support the emotional fantasy of absolute separateness in the simple way ordinary consciousness wants to preserve it. Everything remains entangled in shared process, shared field, shared law. The difference between the hand and the metal it touches is not the kind of metaphysical abyss human psychology dramatizes, but a functional arrangement inside a single continuum. Once that becomes more than a pretty idea, once it becomes operational, possession begins to collapse. You no longer stand over your empire like a nervous king surveying lands that could betray him. You no longer imagine capital as something sitting outside you, waiting to flee if conditions change. You no longer treat the company as a beast that must be controlled with constant emotional vigilance. Instead, the structure inverts. The empire is not outside your field, it is inside it. The capital is not separate property, it is condensed extension. The market is not a foreign territory. It is the visible surface of the same field through which your own intention moves. That is the quantum murder of the owner, not the destruction of responsibility, but the annihilation of separation. Imagine yourself no longer standing on a balcony above your territory, no longer looking out at your buildings, accounts, contracts, and influence as though they were trophies scattered beneath you. Close the fleshly eyes. Let the skin cease to be the imagined border of the self. Let the field continue past the body, through walls, through numbers, through signatures, through all the forms you once treated as mine, until the distinction begins to fail under its own stupidity. At that point, the sentence changes. Not, I own this empire. I am this empire. Not, that capital belongs to me. It is my own field rendered dense. Not, those competitors are outside me. They are movements on the same board, temporary tensions on the surface of the same material. This is not mystical decoration. It is the only posture that kills the terror of loss at its root. A drop can fear evaporation because it imagines itself separate. The ocean does not fear theft. The board does not panic when a piece is moved across it. A city does not grow anxious because one of its streets changes traffic. Once the relation between self and structure fuses, loss becomes conceptually unstable. How do you steal from the field what the field itself is generating? How does the universe exile you from matter if you are no longer standing opposite matter as a claimant, but have recognized yourself as the architecture inside which matter is appearing? This is where the title deed arrives. Not as a legal paper, not as a certificate issued by some higher office, but as a change in operating code. It is the recognition that you are not a citizen moving anxiously across the board, nor even the king piece trying to survive on it, but the board itself, the condition within which every move becomes possible. Once you identify with the board rather than the piece, the whole game reorganizes. The loss of one piece no longer threatens your existence. A failed tactic no longer destabilizes your mass. A temporary market fluctuation no longer becomes an injury to identity. Everything still moves, everything still shifts, but its motion happens on your surface, not against your being. That is why sovereign rest appears here as the death of linear time. The average organism lives in pursuit because it still imagines the destination as elsewhere. It runs toward future ownership and away from past losses because it still thinks reality is arranged as a sequence of distances to be crossed. But if what you sought to reach is no longer outside your present constitution, if the empire is not tomorrow's acquisition but today's field state, then movement itself begins to look crude. Not action, not logistics, not implementation, those remain, but inner chasing ends. The psychological running stops. Chronos, the tyrant of before and after, loses his authority. You operate, but without the fever of becoming. You execute, but without the drama of pursuit. The film has already reached its final frame, and what remains is only the clean rendering of what has already been decided in the deepest layer of the field. This is the apex organism, and to understand why the chapter closes the way it does, you have to look back down the mountain of what has been destroyed. Below you lie the old names, the personal history, the victim's excuses, the inherited guilt, the false lords of karma, the sweating logic of effort, the courtroom of linear economy, the statistics that once bullied you, the friends and parasites that drank your voltage, the ego that narrated fear, the urgency that dictated your breath. Every one of those mechanisms depended on separation. Me and the world, me and the future, me and the money, me and the threat, me and the result. Once that grammar is broken, all those prisons collapse together. So when the chapter says you are the owner of the board, it is not praising domination in the vulgar sense. It is naming the end of paranoia. The real owner does not cling. The real owner does not patrol every inch in panic. The real owner is so fused with the structure that management itself becomes an extension of breathing. The market waits. Matter conforms. Time slows. Threats lose oxygen. The universe ceases to appear as an external judge and reveals itself as a dense, obedient fluid taking shape according to the weight of your unbroken field. Now the conclusion can happen. The doors of the quantum court close behind you, and the sound is not triumph but finality. There are no more judges above the bench, no more lower courts issuing inflation, scarcity, guilt, panic, and earned suffering as sentence. You have audited the system and found that its authority rested on one fraud: your belief in separation and your obedience to the laws that fraud generated. You were the frightened defendant, the jailer, the collector, the keeper of the vault, the one who delayed execution by treating your own power like a dangerous external force. That is over. The trial of your divinity does not end in excitement. It ends in immobility. Not the immobility of paralysis, but the immobility of something so dense it does not need to chase. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of a court after the final ruling when all appeals have been extinguished. You do not negotiate. You do not beg. You do not pursue crumbs with blood in your mouth. You sit in the void as the source itself, and the board beneath all pieces, all markets, all clocks, all fears, creaks and settles under the non-negotiable gravity of your existence. The siege is over. The title deed was never paper. It was the end of the idea that there was ever anything outside you to own. The final exit. Execution of the empire. Freedom does not feel like victory. It feels like the absence of pressure you forgot was always there. You step out of the court, and something subtle disappears. Not noise, not thought, but a constant background tension that used to sit behind every decision, every calculation, every fear about what might happen next. The air is not lighter, it is colder, cleaner, stripped of the emotional residue that once dictated your reactions. What you are experiencing is not relief in the human sense, but the removal of interference. The trial is over, and what is left is not celebration, but silence. There is no longer any structure above you evaluating your performance, no invisible authority measuring your worth, no moral accounting system recording your actions in some distant ledger. That entire architecture depended on your participation in it. Without your belief, without your emotional compliance, it collapses into irrelevance like a contract unsigned, like a courtroom with no judge, no plaintiff, and no case. And what becomes obvious, almost embarrassingly obvious, is that nothing external was ever holding the lock. It was internal continuity. Look carefully at the mechanism you have just dismantled. For years, perhaps decades, every time you worried about money, about health, about opinion, about failure, you were not reacting to reality, self. You were reinforcing a model of reality. Each reaction confirmed the existence of a structure that demanded obedience. Each fear was a signature, each hesitation a renewal clause, each moment of doubt a reinforcement of jurisdiction. You were not imprisoned. You were maintaining the prison, not consciously, not deliberately, but mechanically, through repetition. Just as habits reinforce neural pathways through repetition, belief reinforces structures through emotional confirmation. The system did not need to force you. It only needed to be believed. And now that continuity is broken. Not partially, irreversibly. Because once you see the mechanism clearly enough, you cannot return to it in the same way. Just as a person who understands a trick cannot be fooled by it again, the illusion of external authority loses its force once its dependence on your internal state is exposed. That is why the conclusion does not speak of innocence. Innocence implies judgment, and judgment implies hierarchy. Both are gone. What replaces them is jurisdiction. Not granted, not earned, not negotiated. Assumed. The shift is not moral, it is structural. You are no longer asking whether you deserve something. You are no longer presenting arguments for why reality should bend in your favor. You are no longer positioning yourself as a participant inside a system that decides outcomes. You are the condition under which outcomes occur. And with that shift, something returns, not slowly, not through effort, instantly. Every unit of attention, every fragment of energy, every suppressed impulse that was once diverted into fear, justification, comparison, or delay begins to reconsolidate. This is not mystical. It is observable in any system where leakage is sealed. When inefficiency is removed, output increases without additional input. What you experience as the restoration of divinity is simply the reallocation of what was always yours but constantly dissipated. You are no longer dispersing. You are accumulating. And accumulation at this level does not feel like excitement. It feels like weight, a stable, immovable, almost indifferent certainty. The world in front of you, the market, the systems, the people, the opportunities, no longer appears chaotic or threatening. It appears mechanical, predictable, structured, like a machine that responds to input without intention, without morality, without preference. It is not against you. It was never for you. It simply reflects the configuration of the one interacting with it. That reflection is now different. And so the output changes, not because you tried harder, because you stopped interfering. This is where many stop again, mistaking understanding for completion. They remain in theory, in analysis and reflection, thinking that clarity alone is the transformation. But knowledge without execution is just a refined delay. It feels intelligent, it feels controlled, but it is still passive. It is still the mind observing instead of the structure acting. So the text moves sharply here, from understanding to execution. Not the frantic execution of effort, not the restless movement of someone trying to achieve, but the direct implementation of what has already been decided at the structural level. When the internal configuration is stable, action becomes precise, minimal, and effective. You do not chase opportunities, you define them. You do not negotiate your position, you occupy it. This is what it means to confiscate rather than request. Not through aggression, but through inevitability. If a system is configured correctly, outcomes align without friction. If a company has structural advantage, it does not beg for market share, it absorbs it. If a force in physics is sufficiently strong, it does not negotiate with objects, it moves them. The same principle applies here. You do not explain your position, you do not justify your decisions. You do not dilute your certainty to make it acceptable. Because explanation is often a subtle form of seeking permission, and permission reintroduces hierarchy, so you remain silent, not as withdrawal, as control. Silence here is not emptiness, it is containment. The less you leak through unnecessary expression, the more your structure holds. This is consistent across disciplines. In negotiation, those who speak less control more. In engineering, systems that minimize loss maximize output. In cognition, reduced noise increases signal clarity. You are not becoming passive, you are becoming precise. And in that precision, the system reorganizes, opportunities align, resources consolidate, structures adjust. Not as miracles, as consequences. So when the text tells you to close the book, it is not symbolic, it is literal. At a certain point, input becomes interference. Continual consumption of ideas, frameworks, explanations, no matter how refined, can recreate the same pattern of delay you have just dissolved. The system does not require more theory from you. It requires stability in execution. So you reduce input, you reduce noise, you seal the system, not rigidly, but intentionally. The less external fluctuation enters, the more consistent your internal state remains, and consistency is what allows outcomes to compound. This is visible in any domain: financial growth, physical training, cognitive performance. All depend less on intensity and more on consistency. You are now operating from that consistency. And at this point, the final instruction makes sense, not as command, as consequence. Remain still. Because stillness here does not mean inactivity. It means the absence of unnecessary movement, the absence of reaction, the absence of internal contradiction. From that state, action becomes efficient, results become predictable, and the environment aligns not because it is controlled, but because it is no longer resisted. So the chapter ends not with a push, not with a climax, but with a compression. You stand, not above the system, not against it, as the condition through which it operates, and without effort, without noise, without negotiation, everything that once felt distant begins to move toward you. Not because you pursued it, because there is nowhere else for it to go. When you finally see it, you realize nothing was taken from you. You were simply taught to let go of it. If this shifted something inside you, subscribe to Book Sounds Better You and stay with the next chapter, where we go even deeper.